Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Dr. Aaron Balloch, biomechanist at the WAIS. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us, mate.
No worries, John. Very formal with the doctor introduction, but yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's good
Oh,
to be
you've
on.
earned it.
Indeed.
Well, I hope you've earned it. I hope you didn't steal your PhD.
No, officially I have earned it. I have the certificate. I did it. You don't really. You sometimes forget, I guess, that you're a doctor. It's probably not used heaps in the industry side of the sports science world, but yeah, timely reminder.
What we might do is, and we always ask people to introduce themselves because they obviously know more about themselves than we know about them. So can you give people a little bit of background and context of who you are and what you do, particularly in your professional life?
I can, yep. So currently I am the movement science lead at the Victorian Institute of Sport. So movement science sort of being a bit of a buzzword for a combination of biomechanics and skill acquisition. So I've been here since February this year, primarily working with the athletics program, and then I get seconded into a few different projects in other sports as well. Prior to here, I spent nearly 5 years at the West Australian Institute of Sport. So I was the biomechanist for the athletics and swimming programs over there. So I had a nice little bit of variety in that role. And then I suppose my career journey actually started in AFL footy. So my first role was at the Fremantle Dockers, where I spent 4 years as their sort of pseudo sports scientist.
How did you end up in Perth? Because I know you're from Melbourne, Mornington Peninsula represent. But what actually got you over to WA?
It was the role with Fremantle. So yeah, post uni, I sort of travelled the world a little bit. Wasn't really sure which path I wanted to go down. A few friends were sort of going down the clinical route, but I was probably more interested in trying to go down the sort of elite sport route, I guess. And so yeah, I was fairly patient and had a couple of close calls with a few different opportunities, but then finally got the gig at Fremantle. So that's essentially moved across to start that role, and that was at the beginning of 2015. So
was Jason Weber there when you were there?
Yeah, Jason Weber. Yeah, it was. So he was one of my primary PhD supervisors, and still is one of my mentors. I still chat to Jason quite regularly. So
He's a very interesting guy. I think he definitely looks at things in a very integrated manner, which I think is quite impressive. And I know that you and I obviously get to work together a bit. And before coming on, actually, Jack mentioned one of the issues that we've had a little bit with some of the podcasts we do is we've spoken to a lot of researchers, but sometimes the translation to what happens out in the field is not always the case. And someone like Jason makes me really think of someone who was always trying to find how it applies. Is that something that for you, and I thought it was interesting that you said, you don't have to call me, doctor, even though you've done the work. Is that always been your slant more towards how to apply it and make sure that you're getting outcomes for people in the field?
yeah, absolutely. So I consider myself really lucky that I guess I think when practitioners probably go into their first role, they're really malleable. So you've got to they're kind of, almost a product of their environment, because you probably haven't had enough experience to sort of formulate your own philosophies as such. So you sort of lean into a few other different people and start to kind of figure out what you align with and what you don't. But yeah, I was really lucky to walk into an environment where there was a really strong high performance culture, I guess. And when you sort of combine that with the research part of things, I mean, I've seen some industry PhDs go pear-shaped pretty quickly when if the high performance manager isn't necessarily as research oriented or curious around that side of things. And also, if the team's not going well, that can also be a limiting factor. But yeah, I was really lucky that I got to spend, and it wasn't just Jason, it was the whole team really, the physio staff and the S&C staff and data analyst, and yeah, the whole group that I got to work with there probably sort of, I think, molded my sort of high performance values, I guess, into into some of the things that I probably still carry through today. And I think that's probably, I guess I don't come from a traditional biomechanics background where a lot of biomechanists around the country either came sort of through the AIS scholar program or the UWA sort of factory of biomechanics, whereas I sort of came out of a pro sport environment where my PhD sort of happened to fall in the biomechanics realm, and then I just sort of followed through. But I think having the experience in that elite sport environment first prior to sort of crossing over to Olympic sport has probably kept me in good stead, I think, in terms of really keeping that applied sense of what we do front of mind, I guess.
With that in mind, like, so how does that influence your philosophy? Like, what are the things that you're thinking about on a day-to-day basis that might be different from someone who sees himself, you know, or who has come maybe from that background of being a little bit more outside of the elite sporting environment?
Yeah, I think, something that I learned pretty quickly was you kind of figure out what actually matters pretty quickly. There's not a lot of time for fluff, I guess, in the elite sport world. It moves at a different pace. You've got 7 days between games, give or take a couple of days. And so really there's only a certain amount of time between, when to review a previous performance and then sort of shift the mindset into preparing for the performance that's coming. So I think your ability to prioritize and actually kind of hone in on what actually matters and is what is going to make a difference comes to the fore pretty quickly. So I think that's probably what's held me in good stead in my current role and previous role at the Institute of Sport was I'm always thinking about, okay, so we're measuring all these things, but what's actually going to have an impact on performance? And, what does the coach sort of see as the primary performance determinators, and how can I help and how can I assist in developing and we're measuring those periodically, but how can I assist probably more importantly in developing those attributes that the coach and the performance staff see as pivotal to success?
Well, obviously, like that leads in nicely to some of the questions we asked you, and one question that we've asked a few biomechs, and I guess, as you said, your roles are now covering over onto to movement science as well. What fundamentally is movement science and biomechanics, and how do they actually interplay in the the performance of sporting activity?
Yeah, so biomechanics for me is essentially very broadly the study of how an organism moves or how they achieve motion. And for humans, typically we probably separate that or into kinematics and kinetics. So kinematics being sort of describing how we move. So velocity, displacement, center of mass locations, joint locations, angles, and the kinetics are more around the forces that allow us to achieve that motion. So things like joint torques, ground reaction force, those sort of things. So fundamentally, I think in our roles, we're looking at a lot of the time we're looking at the interaction between the kinematics and kinetics and understanding how they contribute to fundamentally how humans move and how we move. And typically we're working with athletes that by the time they get to the institute setting, they're kind of at the pointy end of their sport, or they're very highly talented athletes. We don't necessarily get a lot of time to spend working with youth. And so I think we are in a fortunate position where we sort of get to push the envelope a little bit, or in the right environment, we have the capacity to sort of really sort of push the envelope and try and explore those things in great depth, in individual settings and individual events. And, we both have athletics backgrounds, so we know the complexity around the differences between the events and where that sort of lends into biomechanical principles. But then I suppose I sort of see biomechanics as almost as a diagnostic tool, and then the skill acquisition side of things is coming in around, well, okay, how do we actually see a performance improvement by fixing this identified issue? So, and that's working with coaches who are skill acquisition experts themselves, just without the shiny certificate a lot of the time. But primarily working with coaches to then sort of optimize that learning environment and look to shift those movement patterns towards more what we see as a primary or ideal technical model and hopefully see a performance improvement. And if not, we sort of realign and try again.
What do you mean by using biomechanics as a diagnostic tool?
So I think a lot of the time, and this is probably a bias in biomechanics as well, and in sports science, but we're kind of looking at, a lot of the time we're looking at how can we improve. So we're trying to figure out, okay, where are we potentially losing economy, or where are we, are we losing sort of, parts of the movement, I guess, around which parts, I guess, are negatively contributing to performance, and are there areas where we can focus our attention to sort of try and see those improvements come to light. So that's probably in terms of the diagnostic tool. Okay, coaches and practitioners have sort of a technical model in mind, and when we're assessing athletes, are there parts of what they're doing that don't necessarily meet that technical model? And it might be, there's individualizations associated with that as well, but it might be the fact that there's something there that we're looking at and we're thinking, okay, if we can get them to do this instead, then we might see a performance improvement. And then, that's probably where the
Can I ask an annoying chicken or egg question?
Can.
I feel, particularly being on more the coaching side for a long time, or not a long time, but a while, there's been a huge drive towards people understanding, in the coaching realm, I think, more about kinematics. They see angles, they see pitches, they go, that's the right position. And even actually the other day we caught up and you showed me a picture of an athlete at a certain position in their block start. He said, well, if you look at this position, it actually looks all right. But then if you put it into the context of everything else, it doesn't look all right, because the next, few frames don't actually match what this would want to be, or for whatever reason. And the question that I actually have posed to a few people, and I don't know if we've actually spoken about this before, we might have, so remind me if we have, but do you think that kinematics drive the bus, or do you think kinetics drive the bus when it comes to what positions you actually see? Because you often get, I think, people, and this is my bias, coaching kinematics because they want to see an athlete in a certain position, but often those positions are a reflection of how they apply forces to, say, the ground surface, for instance.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and probably something I haven't given a heap of thought to, and maybe I should be giving more thought to it. But
is this one of the problems that you have with the 7-day turnaround? You're not sitting there pondering research questions.
Exactly. Before you sort of went down the path around the kinetics, then my thought train was probably aligned with that. I probably see the kinetics driving the kinematics more than the other way around. Our and we don't necessarily, there's ways that we can measure, force output, but once we get out into the field, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And obviously when we're in the lab, some of our ecological validity is lost. So there's some...
Sorry to jump in there, but do you think that is one of the issues that drives this desire for people to make kinematic changes, because they are much more easily measurable, even at a basic level? We spoke the other day about, just even using 2D measurement. It's easier to measure those things for the general coach or punter with the technology that everyone basically has available to them, which is, a mobile phone.
Yep.
Compared to actually trying to get some valid, quantifiable numbers around kinetics, sorry.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Absolutely easier to measure kinematics out in the field. I think kinetics-wise, we can measure it in a gym setting pretty well now. Whether that transfers across to the track is probably, or to the whichever event that athlete's participating in, is probably another question, maybe for an entirely new podcast. But I think
we'll get to it, I'm sure, because I'm about to ask you a follow-up that I think we'll get to that, so you keep going.
Yeah. Look, we probably do tend to lean more towards measuring things that are easier, but the kinetic, I probably agree around that. My personal view would be that the kinetics are probably driving the kinematics as opposed to the other way around. And how we apply force in against things in different planes, etc., clearly is going to have an impact on the velocity of our center of mass, our joints, our joint angles, the positions that we're in when we hit the ground or when we hit the water, or that we're moving on the field with.
Typically, and I'm not sure if we've discussed this, but typically, like when I think about biomechanics, I agree with you. I think the biomechanics is the output. It's the observable output of the movements that we see. And at a very reductionistic, simplistic level, I'm willing to admit that. Basically, I see it as, your skill competency, and your coordination capabilities, plus your physical characteristics or neuromuscular development that will lead to what we see biomechanically.
Yep.
With that in mind, how do you go about, as a professional in the area, working out whether someone doesn't have the physical, requirements, or whether they're lacking, say, the understanding of the skill and motor performance, so that the biomechanical outputs that you're trying to achieve actually end up being where you want? Do you have a specific process of working out, oh, okay, they're actually not elastic enough, or no, they actually just don't have a clue what they're supposed to be doing when they're, running, or when they're, pole vaulting, as you worked in, or they're kicking a footy, or whatever it is?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one. I think there's certain scenarios where it is a little bit easier than others. So I worked in swimming for sort of 4.5 years, and working on block starts with swimmers a lot, and there are a lot of similarities to track block starts, outside of the fact that the swimmer off the block is probably more of a projectile than what it is out of a set of track blocks. But yeah, quite often we see with that start position, we want the swimmer to have their hips nice and high, so that we get that nice, or we avoid a rounded back, etc., and they can get into that nice position to push from. And I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with swimming, but they have like a kicker on the back block, which is sort of like similar to a plate on the back plate on the track. And so, yeah, they'll have their back foot on that, and they sort of really use that to push and generate a lot of their force output from the block. But quite a lot of swimmers really struggle to actually get into a advantageous start position because they couldn't get their hips high enough. So quite often, they didn't have the hamstring flexibility to be able to get into those positions. And so that's probably one that's maybe a little bit more clear cut. And probably some of the other examples I can think of would be around, looking at a sprinter, for example. If they're sort of collapsing a little bit through stance, through their hip, through their knee, or they're not necessarily don't have that level of active stiffness to be able to maintain good integrity on the ground. Well, probably the first thing I would look at is where they're striking on the ground. So is it a technical thing where perhaps, if we use overstriding as an example, where they're planning too far out in front of their center of mass, and so they're increasing the moment arm and therefore increasing their braking force, have to spend longer on the ground to overcome that braking force and produce the propulsive required to keep moving. If we actually changed where they're striking on the ground, does their level of active stiffness does it become enough for a more advantageous position or a more efficient position? So, yeah, those two things are probably examples around, well, what does the technical model look like? And statically, it's a little bit easier with that start position in a more dynamic capacity, such as running gait or sprinting in particular. I think it's probably a combination of the two. It's difficult to sort of pin down one or the other sometimes. But are they in economical, efficient, technically sound positions? And if not, we probably need to try and move them towards that space before we probably truly understand whether it is a physical limitation or not. I guess another one I think of would be sort of an underwater kick in swimming, where really you wanted that dolphin kick action really should come from the glute, come from that hip extension, glute hamstring activation. But quite often we see swimmers, and especially younger swimmers that haven't quite developed that capacity yet, they'll start kicking from their knee, and so they're trying to use that more sort of distal hamstring knee flexion action to get their propulsion through the water, and it's just not an efficient technique. It creates more drag, more frontal plane surface area, and so that's probably one where you'd be looking at developing that physical capacity in that prone position to aid performance.
You mentioned that before, and the idea of developing some of those physical capacities and how they transfer from, say, that non, sporting performance position to that context. How do you think that you close that gap? Because we get all of these, we have these discussions as coaches all the time of, well, we got someone's, strength level to a certain number, their power output in, a squat or a jump or some sort of split squat position, or we were able to get them to their, their reactiveness off the ground in terms of their contact with jump tasks down to 0.15 or whatever it is. How do you actually see that those things transfer, and what's the trick that that some of the tricks of the trade that you have to make sure that they actually can then apply it? Because there's no point having that physical capacity if you don't use it when you're actually in the sporting context.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's where probably if we have a little bit more information around their kinetics, which that's sort of giving us, utilizing or starting to look a little bit more at the kinematics or the positions that they're in terms of, during training, etc., would be the next step in determining whether they're able to utilize that or not. And unfortunately, in this environment, I sit, within a meter of our strength and conditioning coach, our physiotherapist. And so sometimes when I'm cutting up video or, looking at training session vision, those guys will be around and we'll just be able to have those like corridor conversations, I guess you'd call them, that aren't necessarily formalized, but I can say, what do you guys think of this? Come and have a look at this. Do we think this might be a technical or a strength consideration? What are you guys seeing in the gym? What are you seeing physio-wise in terms of mobility, range of motion, etc.? So we are in a fortunate position that we probably have a few different minds that can come together and discuss that as a group. In terms of actually achieving the transfer, really difficult one. I guess that comes into the skill acquisition space a little bit. And to be honest, like we can see a really consistent, regular pattern change in training, but you never really know if it's transferred until you put them in the heat of battle, I guess, and put them out into a competition environment where, you'll figure out whether that pattern has become ingrained or is resilient to those pressures. And that's really where some of those measurements that we take can come unstuck a little bit in terms of the difficulties associated with competition access and being able to utilize some of the technology that we have access to in competition, where really that's kind of where we can get the most value out of it.
You mentioned that you're managing the movement science team, and one of the things that I think about a lot, because you just mentioned it, people being able to execute these things in the heat of battle. Are you guys talking about with the coaches and the support services that you provide, how you can keep elevating that level of kind of contextual exposure? Are you talking about, okay, we need to design training that gives them this context so that it's a little bit safer when we put them into the competition setting? They're not going to revert back to, say, maybe a previously held skill set?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I do say I'm managing a movement science team, it's a very small team. Myself, one other biomechanist and a skill acquisition specialist. So we're a little tight-knit team. I think in some ways we're a little bit not necessarily restricted, because I think we can really positively impact coaches' philosophy around this style of training. But ultimately, the coach is leading the program, and so the coach is designing training and designing, ideally in conjunction with their team, designing drills, designing how can we manipulate the training environment to not only achieve the changes we're trying to achieve, but then assess the efficacy of those changes or how they're sort of holding up under a little bit of pressure or heat. Yeah, at this time of year, if we're talking, we're in October, so we're most programs are sort of easing back into training a little bit, and in terms of having the capacity to explore, playfulness, skill acquisition principles, having the capacity to be a little bit more flexible around the time you spend trying to sort of link that feeling to enhanced movement is probably now, as opposed to 6 months down the track when we're 3 months, 2 months away from the Olympic Games. So, I think now is probably the time that is most able to influence, I guess, some of the things that we're looking to be fairly well embedded by March, April, around the sort of pointy end of domestic season, and then moving into the international season. Sometimes, and I think probably one thing that I guess I've got more from experience than the literature itself is some athletes can make changes really, really quickly, and some athletes have really poor kinesthetic awareness and really struggle. And some are visual learners, some are able to take auditory cues and really run with that. So figuring out if you don't have a long-standing relationship with an athlete, figuring out their best learning style, I think, is really critical to make gains as quickly as possible.
Now, one of the reasons I say that is, I spend a lot of time thinking about what kind of pairings that I want to see, say, even within my training group, because I know that, say, for instance, for a couple of sprinters I have, one has, say, much better frequency than the other. And I actually say to the person who I want to improve their stride frequency, actually listen to the footfalls that the other athlete's doing, because I need you to actually kind of start learning from that. And I do the exact same thing with the selection of competitions that I want people to be exposed to, because I'm looking for certain stimulus from a learning perspective to occur. I wasn't sure whether you guys get involved in some of that planning, of saying, like, even if it's, I think about this, not that I coach any teams, but if I was a coach of a team, when I was selecting, for instance, say, practice matches, I would go picking teams that are going to teach you certain things, not just because they're a good team or a bad team or whatever. I'd be saying, this team plays this defensive structure and we actually need to test against this. So let's go play them in a couple of practice matches, because we're going to learn a hell of a lot more out of that. Is that something that you are able to get involved in planning at that level and say, like, this athlete really needs to, swim against this person in training, or they really need to be exposed to this?
Yeah, given that I'm sort of fairly new to this role, and we don't necessarily have a lot of embedded coaches as such, or coaches that live at the VIS or live across the road at Athletics Australia. There's a couple, but in my previous role at the WA Institute of Sport, working primarily with pole vault, javelin programs, along with a couple of other events as well that had sprinkles of athletes, and the swimming as well. They were all actually WA Institute of Sport employed coaches. So I think that environment was probably more conducive to being able to really get into that space that you're discussing around more longitudinal planning. What does this athlete actually need? Understanding, their mindset and their needs a little bit more by spending more time with the coaches that are around, as much as we are. So that environment was quite conducive to that. And if I think of, the pole vault program in particular, where it was, I think, around about 6 months after I begun, the current coach, the previous coach, who was sort of running the program as kind of like an Eastern European dictatorship model, you could potentially call it, where
the Vladimir Putin model.
Where, for the first 6 months, I guess, I actually distinctly remember being called into a meeting. It must have been about maybe 3 or 4 months in, because I wasn't available for a comp, because I was asked to travel interstate to something else, and the coach sort of saw me as the direct blame for that, rather than what I was sort of asked to do from a different side of it. And yeah, that was sort of a little bit eye-opening for me, having come from straight out of footy into that. But I guess for that 6 months, he would bring me in and push me out, and then bring me in and then push me out. And, I'd come and I'd grab the laser, I'd set it up, I'd take some runway velocities, I'd send a report, and then he wouldn't want to speak to me again after that sort of thing. Whereas current coach who sort of started, 6 months after me, previous athlete himself, developing coach, really good coaching principles, but when he sort of got charge of the program, it was completely the opposite. So his philosophy was around empowering the staff, and he and I built a really close bond, and we're still really close and speak a lot now. But yeah, I feel like he really gave me the opportunity to impact the program and the design of the program, and that was probably more. Yeah, I think I've answered your question. That's sort of where I saw the ability for me to have the most impact, but it's just sometimes the situations that we find ourselves in don't necessarily lend to that. I think, I haven't worked really in team sports in the institute setting, so that's probably maybe a little bit different, where there probably is a bit more scope for that sort of thing. But, you hear working through footy and still keeping up with footy, which is something I'm sort of passionate about still, you quite often hear coaches will, if a player gets dropped, they'll play a different position back in the seconds because they want to start thinking about developing their skill set in a different role in case, contingency injuries or change of plans or different opposition or things can kind of come up where you need to adjust or adapt on the fly. And those sort of things help prepare you to do that successfully.
Well, that brings up an interesting thought, which is around that concept of putting people in uncomfortable kind of learning environments, particularly from a skill set point of view. And I think there's a couple of facets to that. One being, obviously, there is actually a very important discussion around the psychology and the mindset of that. And then actually being willing to design the exposure in a way that's effective, because you don't want to make it too difficult for them because they're not going to learn anything. But I think particularly when you're dealing with adults, there needs to be a discussion of like, we're going to do this task, which I know that is not at the level that you want it to be at, and it's going to feel difficult. What's been your sort of involvement in that? And have you guys, when you, particularly, you can probably draw on pole vault because it's such a technical event, how you go through that process of making sure that the athlete still feels like they're getting little wins, but they're very open to this idea of like, okay, this is an area of, I'm really, say, particularly biomechanically, I'm failing in this area. I need to make a big change, but it's going to be hard to do so. And it's going to be, a period of time where maybe I don't get the result that I want, but it's for the long-term success.
Yeah, it's a good one. Probably the pole vault example springs to mind, and I think inherently as an industry we're very safe. We're quite risk averse. Quite often coaches and athletes, training is really homogenous, so there's not a heap of variability in it. We tend to be sort of a risk averse bunch, I think. But a good example, I think, is for the pole vault example, I guess, so just to put it into a bit of context, we have essentially two very high level pole vaulters in Australia. We have one female, Nina Kennedy, one male, Curtis Marshall. So both elite level, but very, very different athletes and very, very different progression of development, I guess you would call it. So Curtis was probably one that developed really quick, really early, and then stalled for a couple of years. And whereas Nina sort of also developed quickly, but then she had some issues around soft tissue injury and bone health and that sort of thing. But she's obviously well and truly back on track now with back-to-back world championship medals. But with Curtis in particular, I mean, Nina has always had a very strong technical model, and so her gap really was around just getting her on the runway with a good amount of training behind her, where she's confident enough to perform on the day. Whereas Curtis is probably more of he has unwavering self-belief, which I really admire about him. He regardless, he might have 4 bad training sessions in a row and he'll turn up to comp and still think he can jump 590. There's something pretty special about that. But when there was that coaching changeover, Curtis's technical model had actually fed into a couple of his injuries. And he also he'd sort of plateaued. He wasn't performing at a level where he wanted to be and where he was capable of. And so there are a few things that we looked at really almost reconstructing around his running and his plant and his takeoff. And that probably took, it wasn't necessarily a hard sell because
the performance wasn't there. So
wasn't there.
The motivation to change is clear.
Yeah, performance wasn't there. He'd had some pretty heavy injury incidents and hadn't been vaulting. Fortunately, it was through COVID for him, so it probably didn't have as much of an impact. But it was kind of an easy sell, and myself and the coaches and physio and strength conditioning, we kind of all sat down and we'd sort of been developing. So the head coach and I, Paul Burgess, had been developing the technical model that we kind of wanted to see together. I was sort of leaning into him for his experience around being an elite level pole vaulter himself and a coach, and me coming probably more from a physical principles, biomechanical, technical perspective. And we sort of landed in a really good spot where we thought we could hit some improvement. And it probably took, that was probably the back end of 2021 where that started to take a little bit of shape. But we kind of knew internally probably that 2022 wasn't going to be his year. And we knew that internally. Curtis is an impatient guy, so there was a little bit of frustration. He was jumping okay, but then, his consistency around the technique wasn't there. And we'd speak about some of the benefits of movement variability, but I think there are also some pitfalls around movement variability if you're not adaptable. And unfortunately, pole vault doesn't necessarily lend to. It's a difficult thing to adapt on the fly, or a difficult event to adapt on the fly. Typically, once you take off, there's not a heap that you can do to recover a bad position as such. So there were some real inconsistencies for him around takeoff. And so it probably took, 12 to 18 months for that really to start coming to the fore. And then you sort of add that with 18 months to 24 months of uninterrupted training. And, he has the year he has this year, and maybe there's a correlation between me leaving and him succeeding. But
is that what he tells you? Is it?
Yeah, no. He is very appreciative. Actually, he does quite often show his appreciation for all that work. So Budge tells me that there's a correlation between me leaving and Kurt succeeding, but not really.
You mentioned
so there was just that time period that it took, but eventually got there, and we saw his performance pop this year, which was awesome to see.
Yeah, I'm sure that for you particularly, I'm sure as a biomech who's been entrenched in a program, that's actually very pleasing to see that the work you guys put in over 18, 24 months actually turned into some, very, very high level results at an international level. You mentioned, and obviously I know the pole vault wasn't your background. So obviously one of the things that we love doing is educating. Is part of why we do this. And we always are very interested in the processes people go through learning. So for someone like yourself who you get thrown into the pole vault program at WAIS, how do you go about working out what are the, particularly biomechanical KPIs that are actually going to be helpful and supportive for the coaches and the athletes? Because I'm sure you're standing there going, okay, well, I've never pole vaulted. I don't really know what the hell's going on. But it's clear from the story you just told us, you were able to have a really significant effect on the overall performance environment with the coaches and the athletes. So what process do you actually go through to get there? Because I assume that that wasn't the first and it won't be the last time that you have to go from the bottom. Okay, I've got to work out what the hell's going on here before I can make recommendations or get measurements that I think are useful for you.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. If you had asked me if I was gonna, when I was going through study, etc., that if you had told me that you'll end up working with pole vault, I probably would have not believed you. But yeah, that was the position I found myself in. So I don't have an athletics background growing up playing sport. That wasn't my thing. So I jumped. Footy. I kind of felt like I had a reasonable handle on going in to work in footy, just because I am passionate about it and watch a lot of footy. But I didn't. Yeah, like most people probably. Well, now I don't think unless you've seen a game of footy from behind the goals vision, you probably don't understand it. So I thought I knew what I was doing going in, but I actually had no idea. But moving into athletics and swimming and athletics, pole vault and javelin specifically, I guess I had no idea sort of what I was going into. So the approach I kind of took was just hanging around the coaches as much as I could. I mean, as I said before, I was in a pretty advantageous position where the coaches were around a lot. They were employed full time. We were within each other's presence all day, every day. So spending a lot of time on pool decks, spending a lot of time at the track, reading a lot. So yeah, reading literature, chatting to other people that have worked in these events, reading books, just as much. I tried to be a sponge, I guess, and learn as much as I could pretty quickly. And there are existing protocols that were there in terms of what the coaches wanted to see when I was coming in. But eventually we started to move towards, those sort of naturally or organically change over time, depending on what's valuable for each individual athlete and where where the training plans are going and where the performance wants to go. So those naturally change a little bit, but typically that's my approach. I try and build a relationship with coaches and obviously the athletes as well. I like to think I'm a reasonably easy person to talk to and get along with. So I think, it's a boring answer, but those soft skills are really important.
Well, on that, because that to me, and this is, I have a lot of praise for the help that I get from you. So thank you very much for that. One thing that I think that you are exceptionally good at is maintaining a level of sort of professional humility where if you don't understand something, you're very happy to ask. How do you manage that internally? And this is probably maybe not something you've even thought about, but how do you manage that internally with maintaining a level of professional kind of confidence in what you are competent at? Because I think it's a very odd position to be in. And I've experienced this a lot as a coach where you are very confident about certain things, but you need to not get to the point ever where you're overconfident because then you start making assumptions and you start making big errors of oversight. So you need to remain, you know, cautious about what things that you can take as fact or clear assumptions, and what things that you need to be constantly evaluating, and at the same time not get to the point where you're questioning yourself so much that you lose confidence in what you actually are good at and what you are trying to achieve.
Yeah, appreciate the pump up first. That's not what you tell me off there, but no, I'm just joking. Yeah, I think having a little bit of background in research allows you to sort of critically evaluate reasonably well. And I'm by no means an academic superstar. I enjoyed my PhD and enjoy research and enjoy reading it and learning. As I really do enjoy just pure learning, regardless of what the topic is. I mean, there's obviously probably got to be something you're interested in, but because you're more likely to learn things. But yeah, I don't know. It's almost a personality trait, I guess. I'm really comfortable talking about what I don't know and what you hear. My luckily I've had some really good mentors along the way that are really humble, and I've learned, to be. It's actually okay to not know things, and you're far better off, admitting that you don't know things but seeking answers and seeking learning and pushing the envelope rather than trying to almost cover up the fact that you don't know something. Yeah, I think that probably gets you to a place where once you do learn things, you are quite comfortable and confident in the things that you've learned. But as you said, you don't want to get overconfident, because you can change your mind or you can change your opinion, fairly easily. I've seen, in athletics in particular, you see, we have these models around, these are the primary determinant factors around, what we see with podium level athletes and athletes that win and top eight, etc. But quite often the winners are the exception to the rule. And you see some things where you look technically and you're like, well, is that really optimal technique? But then, they've thrown or jumped or run a time that has got them on an international level podium. And you're like, well, who am I to say that that's not the right way to do things? So, yeah, that's probably the mindset that I take in. And I'm still working on and developing around my, overall philosophy, I guess. But, that needs to be fairly malleable. And fortunately, I've been able to learn from really good coaches, and you're one of those, John. And I appreciate the time we spent together this year, and I've learned heaps. But yeah, certainly a lot more to go.
You mentioned something there that I think is really important, which is that often the outliers are not the best people to learn from. What I find interesting is often they will present biomechanical representations that starts to make you question our traditional biomechanical models at times.
Yeah.
And one of the examples I give is, I don't know how well versed you are in the analysis of someone, say like Christian Coleman, with the way that he runs. But he does some really interesting things. There's a lot of internal and external rotation that happens at his hip, particularly through his stride. And it's the way he runs, and for people watching this, as he actually strikes the ground, it's almost like he's whipping the ground, but not from a sagittal plane. He actually has movement in both the transverse and frontal planes, where he kind of whips down. And it brings a really interesting concept that I mentioned to the other day, and you said, I don't actually know that much about it. But it is this idea of, biotensegrity. Now, I don't know if you went and had a look at what some of that stuff was. It obviously comes from tensegrity models that Buckminster Fuller put forward in architecture. It's around tension being created, throughout systems. Do you think at the moment our understanding actually of biomechanical models is actually explaining what is going on, or do you think they are the best representations we have for right now?
Yeah, I did go and do a little bit of homework. I did go and do a little bit, and yeah, it's not something still that I'm overly, familiar in that environment. But yeah,
well, not
it was an
specifically to that, just in general. Do you think that because and I wouldn't say that either Jack or I are necessarily experts on that, but it starts to put into question that maybe the way that we view biomechanics is too much on the mechanical side and not enough on the bio side, because it starts to open up Pandora's box when we go, well, those mechanical forces that we modeled maybe aren't actually a reflection of what's happening in the human body or any sort of biological system.
Yeah,
particularly
absolutely.
when you're thinking about the synergistic behavior of adjacent regions, or biotensegrity works well to try and think about myofascial planes. And that helps to make a lot of sense too when you think about the importance of sprinting is a great example, where sure, it's the foot that makes contact with the ground, but just to assume that it's only about the lower limb is a limitation to understanding what maximizes running performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we sort of know from a lot of the research that some of the particularly older biomechanical models are a little bit flawed, and a lot of these, something that we're still not necessarily good at, and it's difficult to do, but a lot of research isn't looking at that very top echelon of athletes, that top, it's hard to get access to, and, you're not going to run intervention studies with that level of athlete, and there's limitations around it, but there's kind of a reason that these athletes are at the very, very top, and that, like, as we sort of spoke about, they're a lot of the time they're probably exceptions and not the rules. Looking at the Christian Coleman example, I mean, that's probably comes back a little bit to what we discussed at the start around, well, what do the kinetics look like if the kinetics are really strong, and yes, the kinetics and the kinematics interact, and there's going to be a feedback loop each way that has an impact on the alternate. But if the kinetics are really strong and efficient, and are the kinematics as important? I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is.
Well, like for instance, it came up actually when we were looking at those block starts the other day, is the amount of adduction that happens, in the hip and where the knee direction goes. And if you look at, say, for instance, a lot of people made that same argument with someone like Usain Bolt. If you look at his first few steps out of the blocks, his knee actually doesn't track in a straight line towards the finish line. He has a lot of adduction at the hip. And people would say, oh, well, if he had gone straight, he would have gone faster. But the reality is, if you understand some of these models, you start to get the concept that potentially he's actually creating increased force production at his hip by creating a stretch shorten kind of pattern by actually adducting and putting those more lateral structures on stretch before then placing them down into the ground.
I was going to say, and that actually makes a lot of sense, just even from an anatomical standpoint, because I think of, say, for instance, the glute max and IT band, where the glute maximus has 80% of its fibers inserting into the iliotibial band and the lateral intermuscular septum. It's not just trivial. That's clearly a reflection of human evolution, and that force production doesn't necessarily have to follow the linear kind of pattern or model that we expect to see with running, because it's obviously moving in a sagittal plane, even though there's a lot of frontal and transversal components to how human movement occurs.
And one of the things that I think I got caught up, because I had an athlete or a couple of athletes that did that, was start thinking that I had to influence them to not do those things. And what I actually found was, if you teach to more about like making sure that the model that you're working towards doesn't necessarily contradict that, but it's in some ways supports what they're doing. One, it tends to even out a little bit, especially as their physical characteristics continue to develop. They develop more power, then more strength, and they actually have some of the features to support these things. But actually, inherently, taking that away from them potentially negatively alters their kinetic capabilities. And I'm still not sure where I sit on this, but it's working out how much of that individual variability, as you said, the elites tend to have sometimes quite outlier, movement patterns. How much of that individual variability do you support, and how much do you, take away from them? I guess ultimately, if their performance keeps getting better, then maybe you don't take it away at all. But I find that a really interesting conundrum as a coach, and I'm sure it's probably something that you see and you go, well, do we need to touch that or not touch that?
Yeah, I think that probably comes down to, in those cases, it's really important how you actually measure performance. So, yes, we get a time on the stopwatch at the end, and that's great. But, when you're assessing something that might not look pretty, or, maybe goes against some of the fundamental technical models that we look at, but, it's quite possible that that specific thing, which might not be perfect, is actually allowing something else within the movement to really excel. Yes. So I think in these cases, it's how are you actually assessing performance, and we speak about, ultimately, sprinting is massively a kinetics game, where the force we put into the ground is arguably the most important factor. And you might not agree with me, or you might agree with me, but
well, like I always, it's funny because to me, I actually put spatiotemporal features in as another measurement factor, and I know that they're representations of those other features, but to me, as long as they're not really violating really significant models, if someone's stride length and stride frequency hit the numbers, I actually don't give a shit what they're doing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if they're able to create a certain velocity across the ground and it's not so far outside the bandwidth, doesn't matter if they're wobbling their leg side to side, that doesn't bother me. If they're not getting injured, and they're landing, as you mentioned before, relatively close to under the center of mass and all those kind of things, and they're, for their height, they're hitting a good stride length and they're doing it at a high stride frequency. It's like, well, they're ticking the boxes. So maybe we don't need to touch that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably lends into what I was sort of getting to around the performance assessment before. Those are things that we do look at quite frequently in terms of ground contact time, step length, step frequency. And as you said, if they're hitting those measures, who are we and why would we to change some of the kinematics that are allowing them to do that just because they might not look or meet, what we see as kind of a perfect technical model.
The other thing I think with that too is, if you're trying to appraise the mechanics of, say, elite sprinters and you try to find certain similarities in them, there's also probably a lot of quite high level sprinters who also have those similar characteristics but don't achieve the same standard. So I think it's that issue, you always read those books of like, here are the 10 things that the most successful people do. And I think of how many people have tried those also 10 methods and failed in the process. It's
They're homeless.
honestly where you go, don't get too enamored by the idea that, oh, well, this person did this, therefore I need to replicate it in this same athlete, because there's probably plenty of people who've had a similar type of model to that elite person that haven't succeeded as well. So it's you got to be careful with that to assume that the correlation is causation.
So you're telling me if I don't get up and drink 2 liters of water straight out of bed, my productivity's not gonna go up?
You got to get up at 4 a.m., do a 2-hour run, 2 hours in the gym,
meditate.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Lemon water. Yeah, I guess and we're in a fortunate position where it's typically where athletes are at a certain level already before we come in and impact. And whether that's right or wrong or whatever it is, that's just the way it is at the moment and the way our industry kind of works. But yeah, sometimes, and John, we speak about this, there's a floor or a minimum amount of talent that someone needs to have. And
of course.
And this is something we've probably had some chats about and haven't necessarily agreed on it. But sometimes you can only probably move the needle so far with certain physical capacities, mental capacities. You can keep flogging someone in 15 different ways. They still might only run 11 seconds for 100, no matter what you do. But it's the ones, but they're also ones that we can really learn from, so that when we do get someone that has a higher baseline level of talent, then we kind of know where our craft sits. And yes, there's individualizations that come with that, but there's a learning opportunity in every scenario, and the more that we can sort of get out of that, the better we're prepared for when those ones that do sort of come along.
I think the hardest thing with this, and I know that David Epstein, I believe, talks about it, and I know that Steve Magnus talks about it quite a bit as well, of the difference between having the genetic ability, like people get enamored with capability, talent, potential, whatever you want to talk about, and people see it as a genetic endowment. And I think that can often be represented in two different ways. And I believe it's Steve Magnus who talks about this, where the first way that it often gets represented is that person, progresses really quickly. So they might be 16, 17, 18, and they're performing at close to a world-class level. And that's very obvious to see that person has talent. But there's also another type of talent, which is that someone has an enormous adaptive potential and capability, and they just keep getting better and better and better, which those people are often very difficult to be able to identify. So you might have an 18-year-old who's not quite as good as that early developer, but they just get better every single year from 18, 19, 20, 21, and all of a sudden they're 26 and they're world class. But if you looked at them at 18, you said, like, I don't know that they had the ability to get to this level. But the talent that they actually had was that they had a big window of improvement. And there's lots of factors that go into that. They're not just genetic factors. But that, I think, is the hard part, because you look at them and you go, yeah, that person's not going to make it. But they just keep getting better. And I believe, as I said, I'm saying Steve Magnus, it might have been Epstein, I can't remember, but they talk about the fact that, like, these athletes who, one of them is they trained with an athlete who they just kept getting better and better and better and better. And they were like, this is bullshit. Like, I was beating this guy, first year of college, and now we're in the last year and he's destroying me. but it's actually, that's their talent, is that one, they probably don't get injured, but two, they actually have huge adaptability. And that to me, I think is interesting. It's a hard thing, I think, to assess.
Yeah, hugely. And that's such a big business in pro sport. I mean, you look at the draft now, and historically there aren't too many misses in the top 5, top 10. But really, where you can have big gains is if you pick the right kid at pick 40, pick 50,
Yeah.
and he's not necessarily the most outstanding kid in the combine or in the under 18 matches where they're watched extremely closely, but you see potential, as you say, for kind of high level development. That's where if you get a couple right early, which your odds are greater, and then you pick a couple of those ones later, and you sort of start to group together. I think that's where we talk about the business side of pro sport. That's where you can really have success. Is actually finding those. Most clubs have 2, 3, 4 superstars, but the rest of the team and the makeup of the rest of the team is probably really what differentiates the good teams from the average or the teams down the bottom. And having the capacity to and it's not just that person's ability to develop, it's the people that are doing the developing with them. So the physical qualities, the tactical qualities, the mental side of sport, all those sorts of things. When you pair up someone with that adaptability sort of talent or complex with the right people helping them, that's where you can see something like a really good result.
In terms of, you mentioned that's a big part of the sport. I don't know if this will feed into this, but one of the questions that we had for you is where do you see the next big breakthroughs coming in sports performance in relation to biomech and skill acquisition?
Probably the most obvious one that springs to mind is markerless motion capture, and it's been around for a little while. There's some companies sort of do it better than others, and there are some companies that will tell you they do it much better than they actually do. There's some are quite good with their validity and their white papers, and others sort of less so. They like to keep it a bit more in house. But for me, that's probably the big thing that has grown really quickly, and the quality has developed really quickly. So we've been able to get really accurate, high level, informative data in a lab for a long time, but we're obviously compromising ecological validity by doing that. I mean, you can't set up 50 meters of hurdles in a lab and get them moving at max velocity across those. Really, there's not too many facilities that have the capacity to do that. And however many, you might need 50 3D motion capture cameras or something to calibrate a space like that. So markerless motion capture, I think, is moving towards being able to take some of that accuracy, and not all of it. I mean, there's still some limitations, but out into the field. And so, we're gaining a little bit in the ecological validity space. We're potentially losing a little bit in the validity reliability, but, that's moving in the right direction. So that's probably one that springs to mind. And having the ability to get some of those kinematic measures during competition, which, is challenging for a lot of sports, will be really beneficial. So that's probably the main one. The other one, I guess, with skill acquisition, and there's been sort of bits and pieces, and it seems to come in and out a bit, is probably the virtual reality, augmented reality side of things. So, that connection between brain and movement. And, there's probably 2 elements to it that come to my mind. There's probably that brain training movement side of things, but also, for sports where there's interaction with opposition and certain situations and environment, etc., that probably feeds into that space a little bit. But, it's a difficult one to develop, I think, but there has been some advancements there. I guess one that, we kind of see when we watch world champs and events is, it's not necessarily sports science as such, but I think broadcast is starting to adopt more of what we are doing, and the fans are kind of eating it up a little bit. So
except if you're me and then you're getting pissed off because they're really inaccurate. So I actually hate it.
Next point,
but
exactly.
I actually hate it because they're saying, oh, this person ran this speed, and you're like, if they ran that speed, they'd either run much faster or much slower, because that's really inaccurate.
Yeah. So if someone knows what they're looking at, they're probably questioning the validity of the data. But if you're just a sort of regular punter at home watching, I suppose it adds another element of the performance that you wouldn't normally see. Like we see, on the footy, we see like the Telstra track or whatever it's called, where, you get like, your top
Yeah, the
five
GPS data. Yeah.
in distance run and sprint meters and meters per minute, etc. So I think the fan engagement side of it, there's still probably, a little bit to go, and maybe it's an education piece as well around, well, this is what that actually means, and I think some of the commentary that we have in Australia probably hasn't quite got to where the US are in terms of that knowledge and the upskilling around what the data actually means. I think the US do it quite well, and
Yep.
we're probably still a little bit behind. And probably the last one would be, and it's something we've dabbled in a little bit and feeds into some of my PhD stuff, is around the use of wearable tech, so IMUs, that sort of thing. I think we haven't still got to using them at their full capacity yet, and there's obviously expertise required around data collection, processing, handling, and then interpretation as well. But we
Well,
probably still haven't.
I'm hoping this season you'll have a full season's worth of data, so you might be able to do something with it and publish something.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. We've got a little bit, so we're off to a good start, and it was good that we had, results weren't necessarily what we wanted them to be, but we got some good insight from that data around what was happening, which was probably the purpose of it, really.
Yeah.
So it was good to get
Well,
off
yeah.
and running.
I don't think I've mentioned that to you, but I want to use it basically for every competition this year. So I'm hoping that we can collect a heap of that if it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, we won't take up too much more of your time, but one of the things that we always do ask people is, and it doesn't necessarily need to be related to professional work, but is there anything that you're exploring? You mentioned you're a curious learning person in your general life that is taking your interest and you're getting excited about.
I did, and this is a bit of a boring one, but I did a postgrad certificate in data analytics through Victoria Uni. So the data analytics through coding, essentially, skill set.
Are you getting good with it now?
I've been dabbling for a long time, and I probably haven't got to a point where I've had really good momentum for a long period of time with it. During the course, I certainly got to a level that I was happy with, but unless you're sort of using it day to day, the old saying, if you don't use it, you lose it a little bit. But it's something that I do really enjoy.
What languages did you pick up?
I started in Python, and then I kind of shifted across to R, and I've sort of stuck with R now. So yeah, that's what I'm doing most of my coding in, and it does ebb and flow depending on time of year and demands and those sorts of things. But I do enjoy that side of it. It's a little bit addictive. I find it's really, really frustrating because, you find bugs and things where you're like, how did I not see that or something before? But it's kind of addictive because you kind of, you're chasing, once you sort of get a few early wins and things are working, you're like, oh, how good's this? And obviously it's a massively useful skill set in our world in terms of the automation side of things and data processing and handling. I mean, we spend a lot of time doing that, and I think sometimes we probably spend, and there's a lot of practitioners that spend too much time doing that, and we end up sort of being labourers, not scientists. But the less time we can spend doing that by automating things, and the more time we have to, as you kind of say, be curious and read research and come out to extra training sessions and be around coaches and athletes more, then the better. Probably the other part of it, which does lend into, so I'm a very avid golfer. I've played golf since I was sort of 10 years old. So
What's your current handicap, mate?
Well, I lost it when I moved from Perth because I haven't joined the course here, but it was 3 when I left.
Oh, no, you're not an avid golfer. You're a bloody good golfer.
Well, I don't know anymore. I don't get much time to play these days. But yeah, back in the day, I absolutely loved it. I was obsessed with it. I played, reasonably seriously till I was probably 19 when I started studying. But I've moved into the biomechanics sports science space, and biomechanics plays a massive role in the golf swing. And I've been lucky enough when I was in WA, I had a few lessons with Richie Smith, who currently coaches Minwoo Lee and Min Ji Lee and Hannah Green, so three of our top players. And he was able to speak the same language that I was, and so those golf lessons almost turned into us just experimenting and chatting and working through things, and that probably got me sort of off and going with looking into a bit more sort of golf research. And I am a little bit cautious of not wanting to ruin a hobby by making it work.
Yeah, but if you get a chance, mate, surely you can become a personal biomech and make a bit more money on the golf circuit than what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, maybe. There are a few people I sort of follow that work as either S&C or physio or sports science practitioners on European PGA Tour and US PGA Tour.
It'd be a good life, wouldn't it?
It would. It'd be a pretty healthy bank balance, I reckon, too. So
very much so.
Maybe that's
the goal.
Yeah, maybe that's a long term one. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I do really enjoy my golf. I just don't unfortunately get a lot of time to play anymore. But it's probably my own fault. I probably should be making more time to do it. So.
Aaron, thank you so much for your time, mate. We really appreciate it. I'm sure I'll see you in the next week or so, but thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, gents. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Aaron.
Cheers.